So welcome everyone. As people continue to join, we would like to start. Thank you for joining us in today's discussion about resisting green colonialism, stories from hydrogen resistance frontlines. I will take just a few minutes to introduce ourselves and then share the word with Helena of Wismelgas to introduce also speakers and give you a few logistic information before we really start. So I'm Elena, I'm part of Recommon, which is a research and campaigning organization challenging corporate and state power responsible for the plunder of territories and working to create spaces for radical change in society. We target the main Italian energy corporations and the public and private finance that supports them. And Wismelgas is an activist collective that exists to dismantle Europe's imperialism energy system and push for a decolonial understanding of energy systems within the European climate justice movement. They use critical research, disruptive actions, and film to expose and challenge the energy system's violence. And we are very honored to have our speakers here today that I'm introducing briefly. So Mohammed is leading the Decolonial Center, which is a political education platform committed to spreading anti-colonial and decolonial perspectives on history, social theory, and current affairs. The center works to infuse anti-colonial perspectives in social movements and collaborates with a wide variety of partners in the feminist, climate justice, gender justice, racial justice and tax justice, reparatory justice, and migrant justice sectors. Sima Lupié is a fourth-generation survivor of the Nama and Ovaherero genocide committed by Germany in the colony of German South-West Africa. She's currently serving as the International Relations Patron of the Nama Traditional Leaders Association Technical Committee on Genocide and focal person for legal instruments to demand reparations for Germany. She also serves as International Council member of Minority Rights Group International and works as Director for Development Planning in the Hardap Regional Council in southern Namibia. Namibia currently sees a massive rollout of hydrogen development, with one particular project, HyPhen, being developed by German and British firms next to the site of a former concentration camp. Aida Del Puech is an independent journalist and author. She reports on environmental and social issues, mostly across the Mediterranean. Her work has been published in Le Monde Diplomatique, Le Monde, Mediapart, El País, BBC Future, Forbidden Stories, Incaifada, New Lines Magazine, Reporter, among others. And she's the author of a 2022 report on the Tunisian green hydrogen strategy, published by Arab Reform Initiative and Henrik Böll Stiftung. And to conclude, Joseph Nualar Corpas is a researcher at the Development Observatory of Globalization, ODG, based in Barcelona, Spain. In the last years, he has extensively analyzed the energy transition through social, territorial, and global justice perspectives, and the hydrogen development in the Spanish state, focusing on geopolitics and financial aspects. A few words on why we are organizing this webinar. So we are entering a new phase of extractivism and capitalism with new forms of coloniality that are portrayed as green, involving hydrogen, ammonia, large-scale renewables. And we see it as the continuation of the same colonial model used by European countries and by the fossil fuel industry, reproducing itself and following the same pattern of exploitation based on historical relations of power and on the idea that Europe needs renewable energy, natural resources, minerals for its own green transition. So we see it as an expansion of the extractivist model that needs to be challenged for its systemic impacts. And we organized this webinar to collectively understand this pattern and to hear and learn from those fighting it at the front lines and find ways to identify the practices that are decolonial and that could help face it collectively, both in Europe and in other countries. So I hope that today's discussion will contribute in building a joint understanding of the complicity of European governments and companies in the so-called Green Deals, in past and ongoing genocides, and in their role in upholding colonialism through those deals. And we are very happy to have you here with us. So thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Elena. I will now share a couple of just logistical updates. So while we have our amazing speakers speak, you can, as participants, ask questions in the Q&A. So you should find a Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom. And we will ask those in a Q&A session afterwards. Please be aware that the webinar is being recorded. So in case we would ask you to maybe clarify your question that you've asked, just be aware that of that if you want to turn on your video. And as Elena just said, this webinar is explicitly focusing on colonial continuities within the green energy sector and its related questions around social justice, and very purposefully not on the technicalities of the so-called green hydrogen. If you want to learn more about the green hydrogen and technologies around it, we just launched our resource library with loads of different reports on hydrogen. We will share the link to that library both at the end of this webinar, and also we'll send a follow-up email to everyone that registered with all the resources that people will touch upon during the webinar and this resource library, as well as the recording of this webinar. We will also upload the recording on our respective websites. And now just quickly on the structure before we start. So it's structured as follows. We have 2 rounds of moderated questions for our 4 speakers. And then in the last 25 minutes of the webinar, we will have the Q&A session where your questions will be answered by the speakers that they're addressed to. And at the end, we'll have 10 minutes of rounding up, chatting about what a decolonial hydrogen-free energy future might look like. Yeah. And with that, with no further ado, we're really excited to have everyone here. And I will start with the questions now. So the first question will go to everyone, so all 4 speakers, and we'll start with you, Mohammed. We will kind of structure those 2 questions in one: what are colonialities within the energy systems that we're currently seeing? And then in the second question, touch upon the ways to resist those structures. So the first question is, why is the energy projects that we're currently looking at, specifically the potential hydrogen projects, why are they colonial, and in what ways, or how are they threatening to be? So if you could share any concerns around energy projects in the current context, specifically within green energy projects. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very happy to be with all these great people on this panel. I would start before even talking about colonialism, talk about what we mean by economic activity more generally. And one interesting definition of economic activity is that economic activity, the ability to engage in economic activity as people, as human beings, is energy transformed. Just 2 words, energy transformed. And what that basically means is that we as human beings, we have energy. For example, our capacity to turn one thing into another thing, and that is we could call labor, but you can call it whatever you want. And then there are biophysical realities that we deal with in our everyday, day-to-day lives, ecological realities, this planet which we all share together, and the life supporting systems which allow us to all live together on this planet together. Um, and so if economic activity is energy transformed, and if we live under capitalism, then capitalism is a particularly historical form of the way in which we transform energy. And it relies both on turning things into goods and turning things into services, energy, including human energy, the ability to engage in labor. And also, it requires the circulation or exchange of goods and services between different people. And and then finally the distribution of these processes of exchange and circulation of goods and people and energy, of what is needed for us to survive and reproduce ourselves so that we could live for the next day. A lot of it unpaid work, for example, through housewives who are not paid, or but the most important thing is that this is happening more globally in a system of deep inequalities, both inequalities in terms of uh, how that energy is extracted from the very first place, whether that's the extraction of our labor power or the extraction of resources, where things are located, and who has economic and military and political dominance. And to understand then that if this is the broader framework in which economic activity takes place, that is the transformation of energy, um, uh, that is in addition to the fact that it reproduces us, uh, it also means that the earth is a source of our inputs, whether or not those are fossil fuels, which we extract from deep, deep underground, or whether it's metals. Those metals and those fossil fuels are extracted from the ground and then they are turned into finished goods, which are consumed. Now, what that also means is that there are some places, quite in a physical sense, just the endowments of nature more generally, where we extract resources from. And there are other places in the world where the main activity is the consumption of the final product of those resources. Now, if you live in an unequal world and you are then in a place which has access to fossil fuels, or you have access to metals, etc., then what you are also subjected to is either the ability to make use of those resources yourself, or more generally, the ability, or you'll be open to predation by other people who want access to your resources, right? And we can think about this from a country level. We can also think about this from the community level. I think having these as just some of the basic lines in which we understand, then we understand something that's crucial, whether the extraction processes are green or whether they're blue, whatever the case they are, the reality of the matter is that they happen under a system of deep inequality. And where colonialism comes in is that the dominance of one area of the world, in particular the global north, over a period of 500 years, has cemented the situation where certain parts of the world are structurally subordinated and are sources of extraction, either the extraction of rare earth metals, the extraction of fossil fuels, or the extraction of labor power. And another part of the world is the net appropriator of that energy. And that primarily has been the global north and the Western hemisphere, but also those political projects of settler colonialism in other parts of the world that have created a power structure which extracts both resources and money. Now, bringing these two ideas together, you understand that for a lot of countries which see themselves in the subordinated part of that world system, there's a choice to play. The UNCTAD, the UN Conference for the Trade and Development, they have this concept of resource dependency, which basically associates the fact that if your economy is primarily reliant on the extraction of certain kinds of resources, there's all sorts of problems which happen with that. First, there's problems of dependence. There's also problems of armed conflict, etc. And then finally, there's problems of uh, of resource dependency. But I think one of the things that we have to understand is that lots of countries may try to upgrade and not be in that structurally subordinated position, but they may then look at other countries and try to take over those resources. Uh, some countries will take advantage of the fact that we're in this green and start to call for the exploitation of corporations to come to them instead. But most importantly, there's also going to be differences between the politicians and ruling elites who might benefit from that in those countries and the small day-to-day communities. And sometimes the tension between that leads to repression. And as I would just say, one final thing I would respond to that is that colonial domination has always relied on a kind of comprador elite which benefits from these extractive processes at the expense of the vast majority of the populations. And so there's an intimate link between lack of democracy and dictatorship and the ability for a country to continue to play that role of resource extraction, especially if the elites in those countries benefit from the rents meaning the exclusive ownership of the resources which you have, at the expense of, even if that means at the expense of local populations. And so understanding all of that, I know that that was as brief as I could be, is understanding the link between colonialism and resource extraction. And only if we change the relationship between how we transform energy, that is our interface with the world which we live in, can we then begin to reset the structures of extraction and dispossession of one proportion of the world's population, the majority of which have been colonized, and the net appropriators who are a small minority.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Mohammed. I know this is an impossible question to answer in 5 minutes. So thank you so much for this. And with that, I will pass on to Seema to maybe contextualize and texturize a little bit more our understanding of what energy colonialism might mean in so-called Namibia. Over to you, Seema.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to refer specifically to Namibia as a German colony and what's happening now. Also, I want to acknowledge that some of what I'm going to share was co-created in collaboration with ECCHR, the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, with Minority Rights Group International, and also with Society for Threatened People. So I really just want to acknowledge the work that they've put into, what I'm going to try and summarize. The German colonization formally starting in 1884, and the subsequent genocide devastated much of the Nama people's sort of political and social structures when Adolf Luderitz in May of 1883 signed a fraudulent treaty with the Nama leaders, and through which he grabbed territory fraudulently in Nama land. This was known generally as the so-called Milan Schwindel, and which also formed sort of the foundation for the colonization of indigenous territory. The area around Luderitz, where this green hydrogen, so-called green hydrogen, is planned in Namibia, was transferred to the German Southwest Africa Company, including, the rights to explore and also to exploit the territory for mining activities. And the genocide that followed in 1904 to 1905, well, I don't know, if you can compartmentalize genocide, because it's not an event, it's a process. But at least these extermination orders by the German colonial power sort of set the ground for complete annihilation, but also land dispossession. And it was only after Namibia's independence that Nama leaders sort of sought to restore their people's dignity. After the Diamond Rush in 1908, as part of the genocide, parts of Great Namaqualand were also declared a Sperrgebiet, or a diamond restricted area, by the German colonizers, designated specifically for diamond activities, diamond mining activities, accompanied by the forced and violent displacement of Nama communities. And the diamond concessions benefited German companies. After the exploitation of these diamonds, concessions were given out for other mining activities. And since 1908, this area has been largely accessible. In 2008, after Namibian independence, this area was then converted into a national park because of its unique biodiversity, and conservation plans were carried out under the sponsorship of the German government, which sort of perpetuates the German colonial view that indigenous people were merely sort of users rather than owners of the territory. And it is because of this historical context that extracting hydrogen from land which was violently taken builds on, the concept of colonialism. By producing hydrogen on the same land which was violently taken, legitimizes the original sort of illegal transfer of ancestral Nama territories, and thereby it sort of permanently erases the prospect of addressing the generational injustice that was perpetuated on the Nama people. And it also continues a legacy of extraction that has systematically excluded but also impoverished Nama communities, first through what you can almost call blood diamonds, and what is now a very extractive hydrogen industry. And I think, addressing these without or continuing without addressing these concerns would be to participate in yet another chapter of exploitation, leaving people without their rightful access to benefits derived from ancestral land, and also further exacerbating intergenerational trauma on these lands. This is now just apart from the biodiversity concerns and the conservation sort of concerns, because this is also happening in an area which is internationally recognized as one of the global biodiversity hotspots, and the world's only arid sort of hotspot where carbon is stored, and which helps to mitigate climate change. So yeah, this is sort of the dilemma that we are sitting with, where we are seeing a continuation of colonial extractive industries on land that was colonially taken very violently from people. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for bringing up this like really important question of land, and also question of reparation, and how to, how a genocide that now happened so long ago kind of still like is then being legitimized by the projects that are currently being rolled out by yet the same very countries and companies in the global north. With that, I will pass to Aida to actualize from your side.
Yes, thank you, Elena, and thanks for having me today. So I'm here to contextualize and bring some context as for the Tunisian case. So to answer the question about how these projects are colonial, I think that the underlying question is to whom do these projects benefit in the end? And what I would like to stress first is the fact that when we talk about green hydrogen projects wherever in the global south, we are talking about export-oriented projects. So as for the case of Tunisia, as presented in the national strategy that was released not so long ago, the aim is to produce about 8 million tons of green hydrogen. And in this total production, more than 6 million tons will be produced for exportation through the Mediterranean towards Europe, so through Italy and then Germany, Austria. And I think this is very important to take in mind because this represents more than 3/4 of the total amount of green hydrogen that is going to be produced by 2030. And what is also interesting to stress is that the rest will be directed towards of an already very polluting industry, which is the phosphates industry in Tunisia. But I'll come back to it later because as established by the strategy in Tunisia, the first green hydrogen production projects will be implemented in a city called Gebes, which holds an already very, very polluting industry, which is the phosphates industry. And so these projects will be adding to an already very critical situation and will be benefiting to an already very polluting industry. What I also wanted to stress answering to this question is, I mean, it has already been very well put by Sima and Mohammed, but the European institutions and in the case of Tunisia, the Tunisian government and institutions are selling green hydrogen projects as very interesting, economically speaking, as a very big source of revenue for Tunisia, while actually, as it has been said by Mohammed already, it is going, we all know how it's going to end. It's going to benefit to an already well-established industrial elite. And so the whole question here again is who is benefiting from it? How is this implemented? Is it implemented democratically? Who has been consulted for the implementation of these projects? And the answer is pretty clear. And when you look at, because nowadays some memorandums of understanding are being signed between the Tunisian government and either countries or private corporations and companies. And it's very interesting to look at who is taking part into the development of green hydrogen in Tunisia. And you can find some already very well-known industries such as Total Energy, for example, and other very polluting groups. So it is speaking for itself that green hydrogen is only following the path of what is already of the dynamics that are already at place within the fossil fuel industry, within the mining industry, and so on. I also want to stress the fact that green hydrogen projects are presented as renewable, as a solution, as transition solution for our energetic models. I've worked on the Tunisian case, and I can tell you that it's not at all what is actually happening. And there are a couple of very worrying aspects when it comes also to resource, to the use of resources, should it be the land, the water. And the water issue is particularly quite complicated in Tunisia. Green hydrogen projects are very much water intensive, and even if it's being said that not a single liter of water will be taken from the ground, it's all going to be desalinated water. Desalination, it's another issue, but has a lot of environmental consequences as well. And when we're talking about the scale that we're talking about, which is a very, very big scale, this also will have very big environmental consequences on the biodiversity, but also on the local communities. I'm going to stop here, but I'll pull up later for the second question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, again, apologies for not providing more time to each of you. I'm sure we'll have more time to discuss afterwards, as all of these projects are super complicated and have so many facets to touch upon. Next, I will pass it to Joseph and to explain a little bit the context in Spain and how what we've just heard maybe applies there. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, buona tarde. Good afternoon to everyone. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And first of all, just as Elena said, I'm going to talk about the Spanish context or the Iberian Peninsula context. So in this case, when we are talking about colonialism or colonial perspective, I'm going to refer it to the extractivist one, because as a global north territory, we are not very comfortable, but as we will see that there are some patterns that are really similar what Mohamed have explained to us on the colonial part, that the extractivist one here in the Spanish state is occurring. So I'm going to point to three of these patterns. The first one, I just mentioned it, is that in the case of the Spanish state, green hydrogen projects are planned to export this hydrogen to Central Europe. So we are seeing that in this case, it's really similar. It is through the H2Med mega corridor that is going to connect Portugal, the Spanish state, to the southwest of Germany, going through France. That it's like the border that occurs here on Italy, Austria, that is going to connect to the north of Africa, and three other of mega corridors that go from different parts of Europe into Central Europe in this case. Then what I also want to mention is the plunder of resources that green hydrogen projects suppose in this case. And as Aida also mentioned, water and in this case energy are the two main resources that we are also going to face in the Iberian Peninsula, and also taking into account the projections of the climate issues that we will get in the Iberian Peninsula with the desertification and all this stuff, that we are going to have more water scarcity. And one thing that I'm going to point is that green hydrogen projects do not have a huge consumption of water, but what we see in the Spanish state is that these projects are allocated in the territories where they are suffering right now water scarcity, and there are a lot of another economic activities that need water. So at this time, what is complicated is this competition between the different economical activities and also the welfare of the population there. So it's what we point that it's the main issue with water in the case of the territory. And the third point is a concept that we are working with German students that are doing the master thesis with ODG. It's this territorial injustice that we see in the Spanish state, because we are not talking only about environmental issues. There are social, environmental, economical, health. There are a lot of aspects. And at the end, what we see in these rural areas where the projects are going to be allocated is that they are just facing historical negative impacts from other projects, not only energy projects, industrial projects. So they are just facing from during these last decades a lot of this kind of pattern. And then one of the main point is that they just have also the population dynamics there. So there are huge amount of land that live few people, and there are old people. So this is really attractive for companies to put the projects there, because there are not going to be any resistance. And then with the dynamics of the last decades, we see that these are the cheapest land prices that they can get from other territories. So we just pointing that these are the three main points on this colonial perspective here in the Spanish state and the Iberian Peninsula.
So interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. This brilliantly and beautifully leads over to my next question, actually. As you mentioned, how resistance on the ground kind of has implications as well on companies and government kind of choosing where to put those projects. So I wanted to ask maybe in a two-tier question, because this panel also is about like how to fight against what we're seeing right now and the massive rollout of hydrogen and also more broadly green colonial structures that are being upheld by the companies in the way they work. So in the first part, I wanted to ask, what does it mean in the different contexts that you are working in? What does it mean to resist? And in the second part, maybe, especially because we have probably an audience that's majoritively based in Europe. So we wanted to ask, what does it mean to practically build and implement decolonial practices in our work in resisting green hydrogen? So that again is a very big question, which I'm very aware of. But well, those are, I guess, the big questions of our time. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say, and I'll start again with Mohammed.
Thank you. Big questions, but we should be asking big questions. Difficult times, yeah. So there's a few levels in which to understand how we could wage decolonial struggles, and specifically also thinking about the fact that yes, many of us here are also in the global north and reside in the global north. So on the one side, the very straightforward way is that obviously energy extraction isn't only about the creation of goods and services. It's also about territorial domination, geopolitical domination, and it's also about making things move, right? So, for example, if you want to wage a war, you need energy, right? And I think one of the things that lots of the most exciting campaigns since the genocide began in Gaza have demonstrated is the willingness for some groups to sabotage the distribution of energy systems which fuel genocide, whether that's through the struggle to push for institutions to divest from their complicity in genocide, or if it's physically, we're talking about workers refusing to unload or load the kinds of energy resources or the circulation of fuel, for example, jet fuel, which is of course necessary to wage a genocide. I think that these are some of the more exciting examples of ways in which we've demonstrated people's power. But we've also seen that the distribution, the sabotage of the distribution mechanisms or circulation mechanisms of energy have also led to horrific kinds of backlash. You know, one example of this, I would say, is straightforwardly right now, as I'm speaking, just a few hours ago, the government here in England decided to prescribe the group Palestine Action, which engages in direct action against factories complicit in genocide, a terrorist organization. We also saw that throughout the genocide, when the Houthis had blocked the circulation of ships that were fueling the genocide, that Yemen was bombed. And so we also have to understand the risks and the violence in which the dominant systems respond to efforts to do that. But then more generally, we also have to understand that struggles in the global south are struggles in the global south themselves are also struggles for energy justice. Struggles that may not seem like they're struggles for energy justice are. Because there's a dilemma, and that we have to constantly think about, that the global south is structurally subordinated on the state level, but it's also structurally subordinated on the people level. And so, for example, there can be conditional solidarity with a state like, for example, Indonesia, which will engage in industrial policy and maybe think sometimes about limiting its exports of raw nickel in order to upgrade in the supply chain so that it's less reliant on becoming a hub of extraction for export. Because once you have that, you have all sorts of problems. You have these small elites who don't create jobs. You have these resource curses. You have massive amounts of dispossession without the consent of the communities involved, etc. But that said, at the same time in which we will try and disrupt this situation where some states are forever locked in a situation where they have to be structurally subordinated as sources of resource extraction, we also have to recognize that core periphery dynamics also exist within states. And that, for example, a state like Indonesia, which is justified in its attempts to try to move up the value chain, will also engages in its own colonial occupation of West Papua in order to even have the basis for exporting those. And in the same way that maybe a country like, for example, Morocco will engage in these private-public partnerships in order to also try and figure out ways where it can industrialize, it does so by oppressing communities in its own countries, including those colonially occupied in the Western Sahara. And so, just as there also has to be a next level beyond the level of having solidarity with states who are trying to get themselves out of the situation they've been locked into in the world economy. And that also means superseding the idea of that we just need to have solidarity with states and understanding we have to have solidarity with people. And once you have that commitment of saying that I want to have solidarity with people, it gets a lot messier when you start to think about what decolonization and resistance means. Because you have to understand that some of those governments are also going to treat resistance, anti-colonial resistance, pro-democratic resistance within their own countries as forms of foreign sabotage, which are trying to get in the way of our developmental interests as a nation, etc. And so these are the kinds of tactical and strategic questions which we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about what energy justice looks like from a decolonial perspective.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm quite excited about how you can really draw these big pictures, and I'm so excited to now understand a bit more what that then means for different contexts. So over to you, Seema.
Yeah, what does it mean to resist? I think what it means is solidarity. I think solidarity is probably a very key issue because we are having all these struggles. These struggles might be unique in their own right, but there is a common denominator in all of these struggles, and that is what we need to name. For instance, also a lot of these companies that are engaged in these activities, there are international guidelines on responsible business conduct for multinational enterprises, and some of these guidelines establish that there are certain characteristics of indigenous peoples that will require special consideration, and these include their relationship with land, their spiritual and cultural heritage, the sort of historical discrimination that they have suffered, and all of these. We need to call on these guidelines and these international laws to hold companies and governments responsible. What we have seen in Namibia is, despite all of these, the companies involved have not have violated, across the whole spectrum, rights to free, prior, and informed consent, and also rights to self-determination. So, what is it that we are looking for specifically in Namibia? From German imperial rule and genocide to South African apartheid and to the modern Namibian state, control over ancestral land has shifted from colonial companies and occupiers to modern corporations and to the state, with those people that have lost this land largely being marginalized. And we need to see how this perpetuates the generational harm that is being inflicted, that was inflicted during colonization, land dispossession, and also genocide. And so, yeah, we need to name these companies, and we need to shame these companies and our governments until, they do these sort of comprehensive, not only environmental. I get so perturbed when a lot of these studies and assessments only look at environmental consequences without looking at social and cultural and historical factors, human rights aspects not being considered. So, yeah, I think this is how we need to do it, is to look at where else does this happen and how are indigenous communities fighting this, and what kind of international law mechanisms can we use, as sometimes useless as they can be. Yeah, we see how we can use them and forge these solidarity networks amongst each other. I think that's very important.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was my son's phone. It was making noise in the background. Sorry about that.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for sharing those words. And also for highlighting the fact that we need transnational solidarity and understand the patterns that we're seeing. So yeah, couldn't agree more. And thanks for sharing this. Over to you, Ida, to maybe start mapping these transnational understandings of violence and of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the first steps when it comes to resisting and resistance, how do we resist, is to name the responsibilities, to name who is responsible for the problem we're addressing. And so in the case of Tunisia, there are two main institutions that these past years have paved the way for international companies to come and invest into green hydrogen projects. And these two institutions are, first of all, the GIZ, so the German Agency for International Cooperation. And this is something we have in common with CIMA, and because Germany is pushing a lot for the development of green hydrogen projects all around the global south, and so also in Tunisia. And then the second institution is the Tunisian government, and more specifically the Ministry of Energy. And so together they have worked hand in hand to build this new national strategy. So when it comes to resisting, and I find it very interesting in Tunisia because it has really become, a debate and a conversation, which wasn't the case a couple of years before. Back in 2022, nobody would have heard about green hydrogen, which is not the case today. Which I find very promising, thanks to grassroots organizations, activists, civil society. And these movements have decided to name these institutions and to demonstrate in front of these institutions' offices. And I think it's very important, to know who you are addressing, to whom you're addressing the fight, who is it that you're fighting? And I was speaking about Gebes earlier, so the Tunisian city where the first green hydrogen projects will be implemented. Gebes is already very much polluted and has been completely sacrificed in Tunisia for the development of the phosphates and chemical industry. And so now they want to add another layer of industrial projects bringing other environmental problems. And so big demonstrations have been taking place in Gebes despite the rise of authoritarianism in Tunisia. And very recently, I wanted to name him, but a local activist has been arrested and is still in jail, Dalir Timi, for participating to a protest against pollution and export-oriented projects. So now that the responsibilities have been addressed and everything, I think that the second the second step, and it has been said already, is to think of how do we want to implement energy justice, and how do we want to regain sovereignty over our resources. And I think that the key word for it is democracy, because I mean it's all about who owns the power on the resources. And so how do we build systems in which people actually have the power over the production of their own energetic needs? And there are some experiences in places in the world, some very grassroots projects who have been implemented, and there is also the working group for energy democracy who thinks about these topics. Because when we look at these green hydrogen projects, it's very easy to build the link between authoritarianism and centralization of energy production. So when you give to the people the power and the understanding of how to produce their own energy needs, you reverse the dynamics. And so I think this is a very, very interesting food for thought about how do we resist, but also how do we implement solutions and other models, and this it's a call for imagination also. How do we want to imagine the future?
Thank you so much. This has been really beautifully put, and I think great to kind of bring us back to the fact that it's about people power and about democracy and about imagination, which is really beautiful and something that we will speak about in a bit as well. But before that, I'll pass to Joseph to elaborate your thoughts on resistance.
Okay, so thank you. And I will focus more on the second part of your question, because I'm going to focus more on, as a European perspective on building resistance in this case, and just taking also the last part of Aida intervention, because I'm going to also to point three points that I think that could be interesting to focus on this. And the first one is to, as a civil society, to have a critical perspective on institutional and corporate proposals in the case of green, not only in green hydrogen, but in energy model itself, because I think that it is really important from global north countries to have this critical perspective and see which are the dynamics that exist right there. And because what you can see is that if it is a corporate proposal, the main priority is the economical profit of these projects, and not taking into account the social benefit that we need on the energy model, which are also the environmental issues that they can get, and also to try to be out of this energy security mantra that we have from 2021 in the European region, that I think that we have to think a little bit critically and also think which is the paradigm that we need to build this new energy model. So I think that it is really important to think about. The second one, I think that it's also aligned with what other colleagues have said. It's this global north-south solidarity. And the first part is just from the European and global north regions, just take responsibility on what have happened historically, take responsibility, and then also repair the negative impacts, as Sima says in the case of Namibia, all the genocide occur there, but with the other regions, in this case, that the European countries have taken some incidents in some points, and also just talking more in a financial, economical perspective on this, that it's the speciality of the ODG. It's this that as Europeans do not take the green hydrogen or the energy projects as a bargaining chip for debt cancellation for the global south countries, because it's what we see not only with hydrogen, with energy projects in the past, also in Africa, just in Mozambique. I think that it's the most important one in the last decade, this gas extraction in Mozambique, just to debt cancellation. So I think that we also have to put these glasses and see that normally this energy, just to maintain this extractivist energy model from the global north perspective, is just to not think critically on what we can do different, what is working right now.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, that's also certainly like a super important perspective to take on. I was wondering whether someone would like to respond to what you just elaborated on, Joseph, specifically on the question of what would solidarity look like? What do you want people specifically in the global north to do? And maybe I'll just open the floor if anyone feels like they would like to respond to this.
I can start if you want, because I think that what we think that it's really important is this global justice perspective that normally we do not take into account. And I think that it's really important when we think in another socio-economical model, that it can be globally connected, but we just put justice in the center. And I think that it is really important. And we are not talking about energy, about climate. Climate justice must be global justice. If not, for me, it do not make sense that we just go this way. So I think that this is what really, and I think that it's really hard from the global north part, just to, as I say, taking the responsibility and also just be aware of this. I think that a lot of the society here in the global north, it's not prepared to do it. And I think that it's like a huge step that we need to do, but it's really complicated, not only in the institutional or corporate sphere, but in the society itself. I think that it's really hard that people have this responsibility and not take culpability. So I think that this is a really important difference that it's really hard to take.
I can go on too.
Please.
I think that what we need to understand also with these projects is that they are designed to allow the business as usual in Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, it's not renewable for the fact that, we just want to maintain the way we consume nowadays, our level of energy consumption. And so these projects are just there, to allow this. And I think that one of the debates that should be very, very much active in Europe is, as much the matter of production than consumption, And so I think that these projects, take us away from this conversation about how we want to consume, how should we reduce our energy consumption, what should be changed in our systems and everything. So it is just designed, to push us away from this this kind of conversation. And so I think we should put it back on the table. How do we want to consume? What do we want to reduce? We can't go on as we are right now, as we have been doing. We need a radical shift in terms of consumption. So that would be my input in this.
Yeah. I can jump into this also. I think Aida did a really great job of describing the consumption aspect of it. But there's also a question of production, and so I guess I want to push us to think really, really radically. So then that way that we can think more. Then from there we can start to think about what the purpose of our political activism is in the first place, etc. Right now in the global north, what we're seeing specifically is a kind of retreat into the country, right, into the national, and what this is leading is the rise of the extreme far right, and the main point of the main idea of the extreme far right, as opposed to the internationalist left, is that the extreme far right is saying within the territorial boundaries of our country, we want to do what's best for our people as a nation and fuck everybody else. And more and more, also because of the ways in which the far right ideology is very much linked to racism and anti-migrant sentiment, it's also increasingly about the we that we're talking about is increasingly small and small and small. Whereas one of the things that this should all make us think about is to be internationalist and to feel a sense of that the fate of people struggling in Namibia or people struggling in Tunisia or people even in like I don't know in the Niger Delta are intimately related to us. And then to also recognize then that the global systems of production are geared in such a way where they extract from the global majority, whether that be in physical raw tons or even just in labor power, away. And you know this is like empirically tested, right? I mean there's a school of thought which emerged in Barcelona after an economist called Juan Martinez Alier. And what they basically did was they began to measure the physical movement of things from the global south to the global north in terms of exports. And you know, before that, there was talk about dependency. There was talk about the unequal exchange and prices and what it did to the economy. But what they started to measure was the literal physical movement of fossil fuels, non-energy materials, biomass, and then beyond that, also, I mean, they started to study, and they continue to study in Barcelona, and now it's growing. And this is the school of unequal ecologically exchange, the movement of raw materials, which they measure in gigatons, energy, which they measure in exajoules, land, which they measure in hectares, and labor power, which they measure in the amount of energy that's needed for the year equivalent to export materials. And you know, just by looking at this, they were able to physically see, right, that for example, from Latin America alone, when it was exporting its raw materials out to countries where they go and get transformed into finished goods, they were exporting something like 4 million tons in 1900, but by 2016 is 610 million tons, and the vast majority of those exports were going to the global north. So you can measure this quite physically, right? And as long as those are the rules of the global game, there can be no justice, right? And so what that means is that when we're looking at the global systems of production, consumption, and distribution, unless there's a radical overhaul on a global scale, and we're not looking at a situation of the parts which are endowed with the most resources or those open to the most predation by corporations, etc., there can be no justice and there can be no transition before, you know, this planet is on fire and we have nowhere to go. And obviously the rich will go to space, but not us. Yeah. And so, you know, I understand that in Europe, there's this aversion to globalism. That's only half right, in the sense that it's true that there's a global elite, but that global elite wants you to be far right. They don't want you to be the type of person who calls for internationalism and, quite frankly, the democratic planning of economics, not just on a regional and national scale, but on a global scale. What I'm basically saying in a very, very euphemistic way is communism. And so I think that we have to be able to open up those conversations, right? And to think more generally about the fact that we all share one planet, We all have to figure out how to produce, consume, and distribute the resources on this planet equitably, or else either it's the climate catastrophe or it's fascism and then climate catastrophe, because fascists don't have the answers to our existential problems, which are increasingly also moving into war. And so if we still stay in the reformist mindset, I'm afraid that we won't be able to really have the kind of just transition which we're looking for.
Thanks, Mo, for reminding us to be revolutionary at our core. And yeah, maybe over to Seema as you unmuted.
Yeah, for me, it's crazy how, in the Namibian case, I observe how Germany has taken the full circle. It's taken the full circle with its Ratzel philosophy of open spaces, open spaces that can be occupied, open spaces from which you can extract, and these open spaces always being the cheapest option for Western and for European interests. And then, this whole greenwashing that's happening. First it was the civilization mission through this Christianity project. You use Christianity as your way of entry, and now you are using technology as your way of entry into these open spaces. The civilization mission is always about, the social progression, or what they call development. And in order to develop these savages, you have to civilize these savages. Now you've completely destroyed the planet with your industrialization mission, and now you want to go green or blue or whatever it is that you want to do. I don't know which color they are going to choose next, but it's all so crazy. And I think, like there was one speaker who spoke about, the whole system being designed to allow business as usual. And we are all in big trouble, all of us. It doesn't matter where you are. I think Mohammed put it very eloquently, whether you are in the global north or in the global south, we are in big shit, all of us. And we need to realize that without this, what does it call it, internationalism, without understanding that all of our struggles are unique for what they are, but there is a common denominator. And that common denominator is rethinking these production patterns, rethinking these consumption patterns, and rethinking this growing inequality in how it is sort of structured and institutionalized. If we don't rethink this, all of us are in big shit. and we need to really question this move towards the far right, and say, is this what we want for our children, or are we going to fundamentally start questioning this and form solidarity with one another across wherever it is, and across all the different types of struggles that we are in. Yeah, so I think those would be, I find it absolutely fascinating how Germany has made this full sort of circle, starting from right where it started. 120 years later in Namibia, it goes back to where it was, and then claims that it is making progress when it is actually in some sort of diplomatic walls. When people waltz, they are whispering lies to each other in each other's ears, while pretending to the world that they are smiling and dancing, when actually they are telling each other how they are going to destroy each other. That's where we are. And we need to rethink that walls. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this call to global solidarity and for also making the case for German, I guess, circulation of continued complicity in both genocides, but just like more broadly colonial, reinforcing colonial patterns and exploitation, as we not only see in Namibia, but also in Palestine at the moment, with Germany being one of the second biggest supporter and of sending weapons, and generally like just democratic, diplomatic support. With this, we did want to kind of end on a more positive note and one of looking in the future and thinking about what we can do more practically. And with this, I'll hand over to Elena to kind of round us up in the last 15 minutes that are left. Over to you, Elena.
Thank you, Elena. I just wanted to share a thought before that, because I think there were many things were said that are really crucial. And I think there was a question in the chat really from someone who is like working on hydrogen cases and asking what can someone working on green hydrogen to do to help with resistance and social justice, especially for projects that are already approved. And I think that many things were said, but the call is probably to just be aware of the context where these projects are being implemented. And by context, I mean really the historical and the broader context. The more we are kind of sectoralized in our own things, just looking at, the very specifics of projects, and the less we are able to understand the power dynamics and everything that was discussed here today, which I think is very, very crucial for everyone trying to oppose or even only understand what are the actual impacts of the new green agenda. That in Europe we hear a lot talking about, and that some of our governments are pushing a lot. And the other thing which is resonating a lot is that it is our duty in European countries to be able to expose our governments for what they are doing, and to do like a complete analysis of what are the responsibilities, that we are neglecting completely, like the historical ones and the present ones, thinking, for instance, to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, as it was said before. But also we have to be able to understand who are the players that are actually benefiting from this new agenda, and European corporations are on top of that list. So we have to be able to identify that and to expose it as much as possible. And in the case of Italy, we know the Italian government rhetoric, we know what the Italian corporations, in particular Snam or Eni, are trying to do with this green hydrogen agenda. And it's our responsibility to expose it, because we also have the political space to do it. We have to use every space that we have. And the space that we have in Europe is much bigger than what people have in other countries like Tunisia or others like Namibia that were mentioned today. So on this note, we wanted to dedicate the last minutes to to a forward-looking moment. So I would like to ask to our speakers again, how would a hydrogen-free decolonial energy future look like to you? Many things were said, but maybe just in a few words. And if people want to use the chat to also write their own thoughts, you are very welcome to do it. So Mo, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it would just be a future world, just being utopian, a future world where people read in the history books that the world was on the verge of collapse, but that we saved it somehow. And that people used to think that if you were from a certain part of the world and you had a certain kind of metal or fossil fuel underneath you, that you could be invaded and you could be enslaved and your land could be taken over. And that in other parts of the world where you don't have that, but you come from a powerful place, you're able to live very, very rich, more 10 times or 20 times the wealth of the same person. And that, in fact, those people who live very, very rich pretended that they lived in very big, nice democracies when children were in those places which were actually mineral rich, were the ones who were extracting those resources. And I hope that we live in a world where people say that world was a world where there was these things called states, and some people thought that they were better than other people on the basis of where they were born or of the color of their skin. And that actually we don't have a world where we live in states, and that we're all just one big happy family in communion with Earth. And as much as that's imaginative and utopian, if that's what we work towards, I think it will give us the clarity of what we need to struggle for.
Joseph, you want to go after? Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. So I'm going to connect with the second question that you just said to us. For me, the main point is to be in the paradigm of the growth or sufficiency, and more from, I'm talking more in the global north perspective in this case, because if we talk about global justice perspective, we have to see also historically which countries or which region have more possibility to do this development or consume more energy. So if we do this perspective, we see that global north are the first one that we have to do it. So I think that this can be a first point to be in a decolonial energy future. And as Ida mentioned, that it is really necessary to identify which is the socially necessary energy needs that we have to cover to have a good life, un buen vivir, as say in Latin America. So I think that this is really important. And then also just to have a more decentralized model, because as we see, having a centralized model, we have these globally connections that what we finally have is the colonial dynamics between regions. And if we can be a more decentralized model, we can also have to limit a little bit, which is the energy production centers that we have, and also which is the consumption. And in this case, trying to limit, which is the impact that from the global north we have to the other regions.
Sima, you may want to go.
I think I've said much of it already. I mean, who am I? Who am I? I'm a fourth generation survivor of genocide. I have German blood running through my veins, not by choice, but through rape that I've had to inherit because of violence that has taken place. Who are my children? So this world is the world is not flat. My mom always used to say that. The world is not flat. The world is round. It makes a full circle, and the circle is intertwined. And I think the future is recognizing how intertwined we are. And if we don't recognize that, then we are in big trouble. And we need to change that. We need to change that.
Thank you, Sima. Aida.
Thank you, Sima. I mean, I've pretty much said what I think, and I agree with everything that has been said. I mean, it's all about, how we regain power on what we need for in order to have a good life. And so I really believe that also, internationalism has to be rooted locally, and I really believe into the power of local and rooted communities, and I believe that in order to regain sovereignty, we need to start from the bottom. So as for everything, not only energy, but as we're talking about energy today, it's about having the power on your own energetic production, having the power on your food, having the power on your land. It's and in a way that is shared, and resources that are shared commonly with a given community. So yeah, I believe into the intelligence of traditional systems and societies, and I think we should continue to get inspired by them.
Is anyone else willing to share a thought? Okay. I'm very, very thankful for everything that was said today and everything that was shared. I think it was a very thoughtful and kind of, we've been really listening to each other in this conversation. So it was really amazing what, everything that we shared. So I thank you so much, all the speakers and the people that supported technically the webinar, and everybody who's been very patient online, and everybody that will be listening to the registration of this webinar. And I hope that we make it so that we really turn into practice everything that we discussed today, and that we try to really implement the solidarity and the mutual will to really fight for a decolonized world, really beyond energy. So thank you so much again. And I think, we will be sharing, as Elena was saying, some resources in the follow-up to this webinar. So there will be an email sent to all the people who registered. And we hope we can stay in touch. And thank you.